Welcome, friends. My name is Marisa León-Gómez Sonet. I'm the lobbyist for the Refugee and Immigration Program here at FCNL, and I'm very excited to be here today with all of you. We're gathering for our February Quaker Changemaker event, Quakers Immigration, Local, National, and Global Action for Immigration Justice. Joining me for this conversation are Oscar Hernandez Ortiz and Laurel Townhead. I'll do a brief introduction from our panelists today, and then we'll move on towards the rest of our event. Oscar Hernandez Ortiz recently graduated from Arizona State University, ASU, with a master's degree in education. He also just finished a 2-year commitment teaching a 5th grade in Arizona with Teach for America. During his undergrad years, Oscar majored in public policy. His undocumented and low-income background galvanized Oscar to focus on immigration and education. As an undergraduate at ASU, Oscar co-founded the organization Undocumented Students for Education Equity, so they can find the appropriate resources needed to navigate higher education. He's a member of FCNL's Advocacy Corps, which consists of young adults across the nation doing advocacy work in their communities. This year, they're focused on the Dream and Promise Act or any similar legislation that would provide a path to citizenship to Dreamers and other undocumented immigrants. Laurel Townhead has served as Quaker United Nations Office Human Rights and Refugee Representative since 2014. She's grateful for the opportunity to work on behalf of friends in a role that brings together her faith with her knowledge and skills and allows her to keep asking what love requires of us in a global policy making. Laurel has over 15 years of experience working on human rights protection nationally in the UK and through the UN human rights system. Alongside other issues, she leads QUNO's work for a world where no one is discriminated against because of the borders they cross and where everyone who needs protection in another country receives it. I'm very excited to have both Laurel and Oscar with me today, and we're going to talk and connect both or 3 different levels: the global level, where Laurel does work with the UN in Geneva and global policy, along with my work with lobbying the US government on refugee and immigration issues here in the US, and Oscar's grassroots advocacy work in Arizona. In the past years, we have seen important stepping stones at these different levels. For instance, the Global Migration Compact, which Laurel will mention later on in our event. And even though some US and other EU countries do not participate in the negotiations, they're not currently on board in the compact, it offers a blueprint on humane and people-centered migration principles. Oscar will also talk about important grassroots wins that have been happening at the state level here in the US. And he'll give some examples of just in-state tuition or access to driver licenses in different states. However, there is still so much work to do and to strive towards for migration justice. An important topic that I would like to address in this event, and that we'll talk later on as well, is the link between racial justice and immigration justice. Just this month, over 900 people from specifically Haiti, targeted towards Black immigrants, have been deported from the US under Title 42, which in simple terms is the US government expelling immigrants using COVID-19 as an excuse and without any due process. We will get later to this in the panel, but Black immigrants in the US face tougher treatment in the US immigration system, such as longer times in detention, more likely to be deported, and less likely to be granted asylum. Laurel will also mention issues regarding racial justice in the EU and racism within the immigration system in that side of the world. I'm excited to get into all of this, as migration is a central issue and an important issue amidst an aggressive pandemic and record-breaking people displaced by war, violence, economic hardship, and natural disasters. But before we start, we need to cover some tech and housekeeping announcements, and I'll pass it over to Bobby momentarily. Thank you.
Thank you, Marisa. Hello, everyone. I'm Bobby Trice, on staff at FCNL, and I'm running technology for the event. Just a few tech considerations for you to keep in mind today. We welcome you to say hello in the chat if you haven't yet. We welcome you to share your name, location, and your meeting or church affiliation, if any. We are so glad you're here with us for this discussion. As you may notice, captioning is automatically available, but if you don't want to see the captions, you can click on the live transcript option on your Zoom controls and click Hide Subtitles. We'll also have some time for you to ask questions towards the end of the event. We'll do our best to address as many questions as possible, but we likely will not get to all of them. Please submit your questions in the chat, including your name, location, and meeting or church affiliation, and our moderator will direct them to the panelists during that portion. All right, let's see. As you can see, we are also recording the event today, but only the speaker portions. The audience will not be included in the recording for privacy reasons. Even so, if you feel the need to, you're welcome to turn off your video if it makes you more comfortable. And I am serving as tech support for this event, so if you have any trouble or need any support tech-wise, feel free to private chat me using the Zoom chat utility or email me at rtrice@fcnl.org, which I'll put into the chat. Back to Marisa. Thank you all.
Thank you, Bobby. So I'll get us started just with a brief poem and reflection before guiding us into a grounding moment of silence. I'll be reading a poem from Inua Elements the Actual. He's an immigrant from Nigeria to the UK, and this poem was published by Penned in the Margins. The travelers of woods and water who left by foot and paddle, who formed horse and saddle, rudder and sail, forged steam and engine and reached the holy grail of flight. So instinctive was collective strive to boldly go, and yet go further. They went of world, zoomed of planet. The forest spirit child in them who saw no borders in the sky, the winched wandering wild within, is who we have ever been. In time, we'll wake to see the lines, these thin boundaries we have drawn, as utter folly and call out why and when and who and how. As we get started, I invite you to join me for a few moments of shared grounding silence. Great, thank you all. So Laurel and Oscar, I'm very excited to start this conversation and have you both here today with me. And I want to start talking about all of our work and the work that we do for immigration and refugee justice. So all of us work on the human level for system change, meaning that we work to talk with individuals, those we have access to across different levels of society for relationship building, and do that relationship building mostly through dialogue and storytelling. When I was thinking about this, I remember a quote in one of the books of one of my previous professors who talked about how relationships are the heart of social change. Relationships require that we understand how and where things connect and how this web of connections occupies the space where processes of change are birthed and hope to live. So can you both talk a little bit about how you do migration justice work through both dialogue and relationship building and how that shows up every day in your day-to-day work with the UN and then also in the grassroots work?
Hey everybody, nice to see everyone here. Again, my name is Oscar Hernandez. I think for your question about like dialogue, the conversations, like storytelling, like that's pivotal when it comes to like the idea of like trying to push like policy through Congress, but more importantly, just to shift like the way that people think. For me, as a previously undocumented student, currently I have DACA. I know that when I was growing up in Arizona, there was just kind of sort of like this sentiment, you could just feel it, that it was a very like anti-immigrant state, and obviously still is at times, but times have changed. I think what happened though is that when I was still kind of growing up, when I was still in high school, I was very ashamed of like what I kind of represented, like my status. The idea of even just an immigrant seems like it was not being accepted in the state that I was living in. So what I didn't realize was that when I started college and I started to get more involved in community action and started hearing from others that were in very similar situations as I was, that's when like storytelling really hit me, because it allowed me to connect with other individuals. It allowed me to see that those emotions and thoughts that I had in my head were real and they were being validated. It was also easier to like put it into words just to see how others express themselves, allow me to even express myself even better. So I think in a way, having this dialogue, having these conversations, for me in a personal level, allowed me to empower myself, allowed me to find confidence, to speak up, to fight for my existence, even though legally I was not supposed to be here. And it kind of just, it like welcomes you into this new journey of like personal reflection and personal growth. And to be critical about like the places we live in, the country, the politicians, so that way we expect not only better for ourselves, but better for our communities and our country. I think another big part of like the idea of like continuing dialogue is the idea that obviously you're also trying to persuade others, and not persuade in like a malicious way, but you're trying to at least encourage them to think outside of the box, to see the world in a perspective that they maybe never had encounter in while growing up or in their adulthood. Um, and I think like when we talk about, for me in the state of Arizona, I think one of the reasons why we have shifted in a political sense, it just seems that people are more welcoming about literally the communities that live in the state, and understand what their struggles are, their everyday struggles. And I think they're just more empathetic because of that. So I think the idea of like having of storytelling and conversations is just so we can connect with others, like you mentioned, because otherwise we just don't know who we are, and that's when we feel like we're strangers. When in reality we're really a lot more closer than we are different.
Thanks, Oscar. And again, I'm Laurel Townhead. I work for the Quaker UN office in Geneva. So my work involves working with international law and multilateral processes at the UN as a way of trying to uphold the inherent value, that of the light in all of us. And that makes it sound very grand and very distant and very depersonalized. And I think one of the things that's crucial to how we work as Quakers at the UN, and crucial to how we manage to do our work, is that we always try to bring it back down to the human level, and to think about not the institutions we're working with, not the governments that somebody represents, but the people who we're interacting with. And one of the key ways that we work is through trying to create spaces for dialogue, what we would call quiet diplomacy, what I like to think of as trying to make people comfortable enough to have an uncomfortable conversation. And we used to do this. We don't currently get to do this because of public health restrictions, but we used to always do this over a meal, because there's nothing quite so humanizing and connecting as putting people around a table together, sharing food. And that's a cross-cultural thing. I remember we did a session with a group of refugee advocates who were looking at how could they try and create more space for refugee self-advocacy within global policy making. There's a lot of space for NGOs, there's a lot of space for states, there's space for UN institutions, but what about people who are actually refugees? And I was explaining to this person what we were about to do around the table at Quaker House. And he just said, well, of course, this is bread and salt between us. And in the culture that he came from, there was this idea that if you've shared bread and salt with somebody, then you can't argue in the same way because you've seen who they are as a person. And that's what Oscar was just talking about. So I think I like the way that we see that connecting at the different levels of work and how it helps us humanize the people who we work with in Geneva. So dialogue is key, and storytelling is key as well. So we create spaces where people can talk to each other, sometimes diplomats from countries who agree, but we want them to strengthen that agreement amongst themselves so that they're better able to go out and advocate as a bloc, as a group together. Sometimes across the aisles between diplomats who maybe don't agree with each other so much. And sometimes we have a specific thing we're trying to get out of a conversation, so we might be bringing that in. So yeah, I think, as you say, dialogue, storytelling is key to our work. I think the most powerful examples are where people feel able to share something of themselves and people really take off that, put down their flag, take off their flag pin and connect with the other human beings. Because most of what we're working on, both at the grassroots level, at the national level, at the international level, are challenges which are not going to be solved by one person, one state, one group. And so the more that we can create a space where people can find their shared commitment, their shared perspective on that, the more we can move it forward.
Yeah, and thank you, Lara, for that, because in my work, when I talk to members of Congress, we try to do that relationship building and do storytelling dialogue through our lobbying and try to, as Oscar said, persuade in some way for them to move towards humane immigration and refugee policy. But I think something that we are lacking at the moment, and as you mentioned, because we're in a pandemic and a public health crisis, is that we're no longer running into them in the halls of Congress or in cafeteria spaces or more informal spaces where perhaps that social change and that relationship building and dialogue happens. So can you two talk a little bit about how your work and the dialogue aspect has changed during the current pandemic?
I feel like it's obviously it's very different. My sort of like community organizing had always been very just depending on being able to meet up, right? Being able to like organize together, like making poster parties, planning with the whiteboard, going out in neighborhoods and canvassing. So it was very like a physical world, sort of like an outdoor world. So when COVID hit, there has been a transition where everything has to be through programs like Zoom. But I think it's allowing us to understand and capitalize on new tools that I think even after COVID, we're gonna be able to like still use. So for example, like just right now, how are we doing it? I'm noticing how there's people from all over the country. And it's really exciting because like I never would have imagined that I could just hop on a meeting, talk to people that that live thousands of miles away from me. And now I'm going to be able to do that. And even with my own community organizing, we can do that within the state. Because a lot of the times in Arizona, we can only meet with the people that are in our neighborhoods, like in the same city. But now we can work together as a collective from with multiple cities in the state. So I think it's easier to sort of like keep the same messaging, make sure people understand why we're doing something, why we're fighting for something. So in a way, it is like a new way. It is maybe a weird way, but there's a lot of potential behind it. And I think the biggest potential is communicating with larger masses of people. And I think like that's always the most important when we're talking about the idea of storytelling, of having a dialogue, of pushing for certain policies. It's just having everybody behind the same messaging. So I think that's the new way to do it. And I think even moving forward, like I said, we'll continue to use both in-person and online tools like we have right now.
And I agree. I feel like spaces have closed and other spaces have opened. We're losing things, but we're gaining things. So I completely agree, Marisa. I completely recognize it. So currently the UN Human Rights Council is in session. Usually that would be a bustling meeting where a big part of the work takes place in the cafe outside of the formal meeting room. And we just don't have access to that anymore. So we're learning how to create that. I think something that I find super reassuring for us is this way of working of ours, of creating spaces for dialogue. There's still a real hunger for that. Even if we're getting Zoom fatigue, even if we're tired of the online nature of it, the desire to connect with other people is still really strong. And there's a real hunger for the ways in which we're able to do that. And so we've been able to move some of that online. And I remember just before the first of these that I did online, I was like, it won't work. This works because people are in person, because they can be informal, because we're feeding them, because of all of these things. But actually it works because we create a safe space where people can be themselves and can connect. And that worked just as well over Zoom. In some ways, it just means instead of the informality of being around the Quaker House table, we have the informality of everybody sitting in their own kitchen. So you have people's children popping in the background, you have their exercise machines, and we're just learning to talk to each other again in ways that I think are really powerful. And the other thing I'd say, for the spaces that we work in for the UN, there's risks around closure of space for civil society, but also these virtual ways of working are opening up the possibility for us to create conversations with people we wouldn't otherwise be able to get to Geneva, either because of funding or because of visa restrictions. And so what we're looking at now is how do we create those spaces where we have people who are responsible for developing policy, but we also have people who are affected by those policies more able to engage in those conversations. And that's something that I hope we will learn to do and take, as Oscar was saying, things we learn to do now out of necessity that we'll take forward with us when hopefully the in-person coffee, bumping into people in the corridor part of our work comes back as well.
Right. And I think an important part that you two mentioned was that now there's new opportunities for people coming in together in a virtual setting. Perhaps it wasn't happening before because it required expensive traveling and taking days off and going from one continent to the other. But this past summer, several Quaker organizations came together virtually, which allowed, multiple conversations and back and forth without having to move, and came together to draft a Quaker Statement on migration justice. And we'll put it in the chat, the link, so everyone can read it a little bit more. But I'll just read a small sentence, which says that we're committed to working for a world where dignity and rights are upheld regardless of migration status, and not on the basis of citizenship or perceived deservedness. Our faith calls us to work alone and with others for migration justice. So I want to bring in this statement into the conversation. Laurel, I know that you were part of the process and involved in the drafting and everything that, involved coming out with the statement, and several different organizations were involved in this, as I say. But can you talk a little bit about this statement, and then we'll move towards of how Friends are working towards the vision of migration justice at all different levels, global, nationally, and locally.
So just very briefly, one of the places that the statement comes from me is this memory I have of sitting in an enormous tent that had been put up in the desert just outside Marrakesh for a huge UN conference for the adoption of the Global Compact for Migration, the first ever UN agreement on all aspects of migration, and one that puts people-centeredness as its first guiding principle, really a conversation shifter at the global level. And I sat there in this strange tent in the desert, and as this agreement was being adopted, which we spent a couple of years working really intensively on, and at the same moment there was a young Quaker I knew who was being sentenced in the UK for her action to stop a deportation flight, for breaking into an airport and lying down in front of the plane with 15 other people. And at the same time, there were friends in the US participating in in interfaith worship and prayer across the southern border as part of the Love Knows No Borders action. And it really struck me as I looked at something we'd worked on and felt its flaws, but also its possibilities, just this thread that ran through these really different expressions of Quaker witness. And what I wanted to do, and what we were able to work then with other Quaker organizations who are active on migration to do, was to express what is it that's common, even if our work looks quite different. And sadly, I don't get to do the poster parties that Oscar's talking about. That's not what my work looks like. But where's the common thread between our work, and how do we talk about that? And really to give ourselves a chance to step out of the policy speak that I spend so much time working in, and think really about what is it that our faith is asking of us? What is it that we are expressing that is about friends' concerns when we do this? And that's what that's part of the genesis of the Quaker Statement, of a Quaker Statement. And it's really intended to be a Quaker Statement. It is the view of this group of organizations who work on this at this moment. What can we say? And then our interest was in strengthening what we could say by talking to each other, by learning from each other, by testing it with each other, and now to put that out there and see if it resonates with other friends, to see what comes back from the discussions it starts or the support it gets. So that's really some of where that came from.
Thank you, Laurel, for that. And, speaking of migration justice and what we want to see happening, Oscar, I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about the grassroots works that you do. I know you've mentioned a couple of things, but I was wondering if you can expand a little bit about what your work entails, especially through the Advocacy Corps of FCNL at the moment.
Yeah, so I think most of my experience started, when I was in undergrad and college. One of the biggest accomplishments and something I'm really proud of was co-founding a undocumented student group on campus. And I think that was really important for college students, high school students, simply because it was a space at an institution where students were kind of allowed to have that conversation, those dialogue conversations with anybody. I mean, we welcome anybody, allies, people that just wanted to learn more. But it was just kind of a place for you to be accepted for who you are, right? Especially in states like Arizona, it seems like you're always trying to hide from everybody who you really are. So it was kind of like a nice spot to have that where you can be kind of welcome. On top of that, you know, it was also a place where we try to like find resources for like our community. So that meant people that were going to the same university as us, or like I said, maybe it's a high schooler that just kind of found our social media, and then now they're able to like find a scholarship to go to our university, other places. But another big sort of pillar of what we wanted to work towards too was advocacy for legislation. At the time, we were fighting to keep our in-state tuition in the state of Arizona. We did have like the governor and like the attorney general attacking it, different legislators. At the same time, at the national level with the past administration, we did have the program being threatened to be taken down. So there was always actions happening at different levels of government. In Arizona, it even got to the point where it went to the Supreme Court. So we were always kind of like having to be following politics, identifying key stakeholders, realizing what's the best type of messaging, you know, and honestly, like recruiting and trying to like invest in the younger generation. So currently there's still that student group that I was talking about still exists. They're still doing work, even though I'm not part of the university anymore. But just, you know, the fight doesn't stop. One of the things that how I ended up learning about FCNL is because of the Advocacy Corps program. And it was really exciting that it happened to be about immigration, the core year that I'm doing it. Other years they do different topics, but that's something that I really appreciated because not everybody on the immigration cohort necessarily has an intense background in immigration, but I appreciate that because it brings other issues. You know, people that are involved with gun violence or people that are interested in the environment. And I think like when you're involved in this kind of stuff, when you're a person that likes politics, that wants to be involved in changing the world, I think you realize that all issues and topics kind of like intersect and connect with one another. So with the Advocacy Corps, something that we've all been working in our respective states, have been trying to get op-eds out, letters to the editors, telling, you know, people in our communities, hey, like this should be something that we should be talking about with ourselves, with our friends or family. You know, it's at least asking ourselves, like, where do we stand with this? Are we really going to support these dreamers, right? Like we always kind of mention, or, you know, am I going to like maybe talk to my legislators, especially the local ones, to maybe make sure that our laws in our states, you know, actually support students. Something that I'm doing right now, for example, is applying to law schools. And something that I have to do is kind of make sure that the state that I'm applying to is a little more friendly to my immigrant status. So that way I don't have to pay, you know, out-of-state tuition, even if I've been living there for 5 years and so on. So there's always like many different battles that we're doing. And I think like as I'm growing, as I'm pursuing my future, I'm realizing how just kind of everything ties together. And but it's very obvious how my immigrant status never kind of stops following me, right? So I feel like everywhere that I go, at every new stage in my career, it seems like I just kind of learn a new sort of thing about it. But I think that the larger conversation is just making sure that we continue to develop the youth. I think that's why I like the FCNL program. It's doing exactly that. And it's just allowing people to really find that confidence of like, hey, you know, I can be a change maker in immigration, for example, or in any other topic that I choose. And it's just giving you the tools to prepare for that. So.
Yeah, thank you, Oscar, for that. And I thought you brought I'll start with one interesting point around how immigration justice intersects with different topics, and it's not just a tunnel vision on how to achieve migration justice. I believe that we need to have intersectionality and see how it connects with other issues. You mentioned climate change and the environment, and we've seen a lot of migration moving around climate change. So we can talk about that, but also a topic that I want to bring in is the link between racial justice and immigration justice. And the Quaker Statement recognizes longstanding and pervasive structures of domination and global power imbalances as reasons of why people from different parts of the world need to migrate into others. So I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about racial equity with immigration policy and how Quakers are addressing issues of racism and white supremacy within their work.
Yeah, I feel like when I try to answer that question, when I try to think about an answer for that question, I feel like, you know, we almost have to talk about like the world leaders in the world, and, you know, how like obviously they influence a lot of stuff and through economies, through policies, through wars. And, this has been happening for obviously centuries, right? And I think like a lot of the times we forget to talk about that because that has been influencing the reasons as to why people migrate, why the reasons why people have to leave their own countries and their cultures. And the reason as to why countries like the US, should have a serious conversation of like, okay, what are we doing? What actions are we doing in at the world stage that's affecting other countries? And that's why we see all these people wanting to move to places like the US. And I don't think people really want to have the conversation, it seems like. And I think I think the reason why is because it is a challenging conversation to have. I mean, even just in the US, right, it seems like people just don't want to have any more immigrants, or if they do say, okay, let's have some, we always are saying like we want the highly educated or the ones that are already very well accomplished, and it seems like they just don't want anybody else. So I think that's kind of a problem that we just have in our society. For example, when I was as an educator, there was like this parallel where, I saw some of our students were being treated very well. Like I think a lot of people saw the potential in them, and everybody else seems to be being disregarded, right? So I think in the topic of immigration, it seems like we have like these sort of underlying desires of who we want as immigrants. And, we do see it through race at times. Something that I started doing recently is volunteering with a local group here, and we help people that just been released from the ICE facilities in Arizona. Something that I learned that surprised me is that depending, it seems like, on what country those folks are coming from, the amount of bail that they can pay to be released varies. So it seems like there's like desired countries and undesired countries, and the undesired countries you have to pay almost like double or triple the amount. And there doesn't seem to be any other reason other than just the country they come from. So there are things that I think are happening in our administrations that, I think more people should be aware of, because I think like it's obvious that, when we talk about immigration, it's very clear that there's a very specific type of immigration we want. And I don't know if like our general population wants to address that right now.
I think it's a huge question and a huge topic, and I think to be completely honest, from the Quaker United Nations Office point of view on our Human Rights and Refugees program, we're really early on in understanding how we are more intentional and more explicit in how we link racial justice and migration justice. And that's work that we're involved in currently. And some of that is about and connects to the fact that these are not conversations that have been well linked at the sorts of levels that we work at. I mean, obviously they are very closely linked in the lives of people who are experiencing the intersectionality. And I think we have to be really careful when we talk about rising understanding of the impact of racism. It's a rising understanding of the impact of racism for some people, of something that has been very clear and very direct for other people for a very long time, for their whole lives, for generations. So I think we're having a moment of greater understanding in the and an opening in the policy circles that we work in at the UN level. I said this to Marisa the other day. On Monday, the UN Human Rights Council was opened. They have a statement from the Secretary General of the UN who talked about the impact of the legacy of colonialism on the racism that we see in the world today. We also had the President of the General Assembly say, we all need to check our own privilege. Now, these are perhaps obvious statements for many people, but they're coming out of unobvious mouths. So these are not the people we have heard say these things before. So how do we use those moments? And for us at QUNO, a big part of that is about recognizing what our limitations are as an organization and whose voices it is other than ours who need to be heard. So how do we use the kind of privileged access that we have of being in Geneva, of being able to create these open dialogue spaces to bring in the people who we think aren't being heard yet properly in these spaces, who will have the experience and the expertise to help shape those conversations next. So I think it's a really challenging moment, but also a potential moment of significant shift. on that. And I just want to point out the work of other Quaker organizations, and the statement came out of a grouping of Quaker organizations who work on migration, which has been really helpful, and the work that the Quaker Council for European Affairs are already doing from an anti-racist perspective on migration has been really helpful for my learning, as has some of the work of the American Friends Service Committee as well. So, and FCNL, the opportunity to learn from each other has been really, really helpful at this moment.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I want to highlight especially, and I think we have mostly a US audience here, but I want to highlight that in the US, we have, you know, a new Congress and a new administration, which seems to be a brand new opportunity to work in migration policy and work towards a more humane and inclusive system. However, I think we need to keep having that push that we had under the previous administration, in terms that even though we have this new opportunity, this racism and this work that we're talking about is still very much present in those systems. And just as I was mentioning at the beginning of the event, currently in February, more than 900 people have been deported to Haiti, mostly Black immigrants under Title 42, which is using COVID-19 as an excuse to expel immigrants and refugees from the US, or asylum seekers from the US, without any due process. And this is happening right now as we speak. And what I've been hearing a lot from Black organizations and Black activists is that we've seen the outcry, especially under the previous administration, of different policies that were put in place and that were not deemed humane. We saw an outcry when we had the Muslim ban. We saw the outcry when we had families separated from, children separated from their parents. And I think right now they're calling for a similar outcry because it's Black immigrants who are being targeted. As I said at the beginning, also Black immigrants are treated in a different way within the immigration system. They're more likely to be deported, less likely to be granted asylum. Less granted to be granted asylum, and more likely to spend more time in detention centers, among other things. I've written about this in an article that is posted currently on our FCNL website. And I think these conversations are important to have and to keep the momentum going, despite the fact that we're under a new administration, new Congress, and it seems that we have a brand new opportunity to create migration justice. But we need to keep moving towards that with the same momentum that we had in the previous administration. And I guess, Oscar, I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about some of the legislation that we're working on, specifically around Dreamers, but other groups of undocumented people here in the US who we are fighting for a pathway to citizenship. But in our previous, some conversations that I've had with you, you mentioned those are sort of Band-Aid solutions and not real solutions. So I wanted you to tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, with kind of like the last couple of things that were said, it's something that I was thinking about is I think one of the reasons why I call it a Band-Aid solution every time we have like an immigration bill is because it seems like that's just how we go about everything else we do in this country. Like when I see things of like, why is it that we can't get an immigration system that works for our country, our current citizens and other immigrants? I think it's just because, like, I mean, let's think about how we treat people in our jails. Like, let's think about how most people cannot have access to, it seems like, you know, some type of like Medicare, our infrastructure. We just saw that with Texas the other day, how like a single state, you know, a couple of days of snow really sort of like damaged them. People die from that instance. So it's almost seems like our country just, it's not getting it right. It's not working for the people. I am seeing those changes. There is this momentum happening. And I think like that's why something like the bills that are being proposed right now feel like a Band-Aid solution, simply because like even if they do pass, like I think there's one that the current president is supporting. It says something as simple as like, well, if you're in this country as an undocumented individual before January of 2021, then you can apply to this bill. But the problem with that is that there's going to be more people coming into this country that are going to find themselves in the situation that I did, you know, 15 years ago. So to them, we're gonna, you know, what I'm saying is like in 2 decades, we're gonna have like the same reoccurring issue where we're gonna have another population of undocumented immigrants that are obviously gonna be, you know, going through the same problems as we are right now, and there's gonna be no solution for them. So I think like the bigger problem is that yes, we can pass legislation, yes, we can make you know, ourselves feel better in the moment and do help, you know, thousands of lives right now. But ultimately, we're not setting ourselves up for a sustainable future, a future where like, hey, we're critical in whatever systems or whatever bills we pass, and that's what we have an effective country. Because it seems redundant that every 25 years we have to have an immigration bill discussion just because we couldn't get it right the first time. And it almost seems like we're not progressing, or at least we're not, focusing on other issues that, we need to be focusing in our countries and abroad. So I am excited for what's to come, and I will gladly welcome whatever comes our way. But I feel like for me personally, I don't think like as soon as I can get citizenship, I don't think I'm going to be like, all right, let's forget about immigration and carry on my life. Because, there are larger problems in this country, in this world. And that's just something that fascinates me at this point. But I think we should expect more from the people we're putting in office. I think we're a great country. And like, I feel like we should show it through the bills that we pass. And I think sometimes that's lacking. But yeah, maybe it's a Band-Aid solution for now, but I'm sure larger things are coming their way.
Yes, thank you, Oscar. Laurel, do you want to offer any sort of closing remarks before we move to the Q&A portion of the event?
No, I'm good to hear people's questions and see how we go. I have a lot of thoughts and a lot of things to say, but it looks like from the chat, so does some of the audience as well. So let's take it from them if that's okay.
Yes, and thank you both for joining me today. Oscar, I agree. We need to pass those important bills and provide relief to thousands of people, but then we also need to keep the bigger picture in mind and keep on that, have that Quaker Statement present and see that migration justice vision hopefully realized one day. So I'll move us on to the Q&A. The first question, Laurel, is for you, Peggy Roski. And sorry if I do not pronounce your last name correctly. Laurel, what is your particular work and why is it locating you in Geneva instead of New York?
Okay, I'll do the quick and fairly technical answer to that question. There are two offices of the Quaker United Nations Office, people may know. There's one situated in New York and one situated in Geneva, two of the biggest hubs of the headquarters of the UN. And the programs that we run out of those offices are shaped and responsive to the institutions of the UN that are in those cities. So I work on human rights and refugee issues, and that's situated in Geneva because the Human Rights Council, the human rights architecture of the UN is situated in Geneva. The Refugee Agency of the UN is situated in Geneva, as is the International Organization for Migration. So it's mostly a matter of practicality. In fact, for the Global Compact for Migration, which we talked about, that process was negotiated in New York. So during that period, I spent quite a bit of time coming to New York, working with our friends in the office there, using their table as our Quaker House table to bring people round. But yeah, essentially it's what happens in those cities shapes the work of the two offices.
Great. I really like the next question from Betty Hoover, who says, how can allies tell the story of affected people with the most respect and sensitivity?
I'll answer that. I think like one of the best ways to do it now that I'm thinking like with Zoom is like maybe actually just have them be the ones speaking, right? If we have this power of meeting people online and maybe, reaching out to them, letting them like, hey, maybe have like a group of friends or like a specific club or organization that I would love for you to speak with. I think that'll be a great way for you to be for them to be authentic and for the conversation to be authentic. But if it's something like, let's say, less or more casual, where you're just talking with like family, friends, whatever, I think just being honest about like where you stand with something and just maybe opening discussion, right? Like I personally like conversing with people about things that are difficult to converse about, simply because I feel like I'm being honest. And I think like when it comes to building those relationships with family members and friends, I think we always want people to be authentic with each other. If you're trying to share a story that you heard, then I think like our own conscience knows when we're trying to like maybe add something or maybe lie. So just be honest with what you heard, with how you felt from what you heard. And ultimately, like, it's just going to be a conversation starter, right? If the conversation of whatever topic you're trying to continue, then maybe that's when maybe the proposal of like, hey, let me bring that person I heard that story from into the conversation. because you're right, it's hard to speak for them if they're not there, or maybe you just heard them for 30 minutes at an event like ours right now, right? So I would say that.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, I think just if you're going to share someone's story, first make sure that you have their permission and that you've talked to that person about sharing their story and having their consent to share it with other people. And also, I think it's important to talk about privilege. And I am myself, I'm from Honduras, but I come from a privileged background. So when I talk to members of Congress or their staffers and I want to do storytelling, I make sure that the story that is told is myself and what I've experienced myself in Honduras and why I understand that other people must migrate from Honduras to the US. But I also try to keep in mind that, you know, immigrants, often their stories are told within a very victim perspective point of view. And I think the resilience that immigrants have, and, you know, I think it has to be a combination of both. To one, say exactly why people are decided to come to the United States, but also we do not want to re-victimize people. And that's something very important to me that I keep present whenever I talk to, you know, in my lobbying visits to Congress. I also just want to say if people want to add more questions to the Q&A, now will also be the time, but I'll keep us moving along. So the next question, what models are being used instead of detention while due process is happening? I'm afraid this may be out of all of our areas of expertise.
Then I'm going to jump in and suggest other sources, if that's okay.
Yes,
so
please.
We work quite closely with an organization called the International Detention Coalition. They're a coalition of organizations around the world who work on alternatives to detention and showing and supporting alternatives to immigration detention. And something I would say about, we've been talking about sharing stories. Oscar was talking about the things that he's set up and the value that they have in the community they have. I think one of the other connections I want to make between the kind of grassroots and the international is the way in which there is benefit in using the international spaces and platforms for international dialogue to share those good practices. So sharing the idea of what's happening in one community can help another community think about how that's adaptable in their country, how that might work for them. And I want to tie that back to the detention question and just say that the Immigration Detention Coalition has been taking, there's one tiny paragraph. Sometimes our work is about tiny words. You know this in working on legislation as well. It can be about these particular sentences that we really want in an agreement. And the agreement of the Global Compact for Migration contains a commitment to working towards ending child immigration detention. And so the International Detention Coalition has been taking that and using this idea of dialogue to create peer learning spaces where governments who are struggling with this question of, we know we shouldn't be detaining children, but we can't quite work out how not to do the things that they still think are necessary as part of their immigration control processes, which may or may not be necessary, but which they still think are necessary. They've been sharing ideas of and sharing the practices that they have so that those can be replicated in other countries. And it's really exciting to see that grow and to see those kind of dialogue spaces be used for one government that's getting part of their policy right or better to share that with another one, to say, this is the challenges, this is how we persuaded our parliaments, this is how we persuaded our public, this is how we trialed it, this is how we tested it, this is what we're learning. And so I think we have so much to learn from what happens at a community level, what happens at a human level, to then be shared and replicated through the kind of international spaces that we have. So that doesn't answer your question specifically, but it does hopefully let you know that there are people who are working hard on this and on how you draw from experiences across the world to try and really give examples of how this can be done.
And really quick, something I would say with my limited experience with detention centers is that I've come to realize just from you know, helping those people that have been just dropped off from ICE detention centers, it's just that it seems like that whole industry is very privatized, just like we see it with like our regular prisons for citizens. And you know, and it's just, I think that's kind of one of the big things that people are pushing against, the idea of like private companies being involved with detaining, especially immigrants. or anybody. And it's just because like, obviously, I think we all inherently can feel how that can be a slippery slope for just kind of keeping people there, just throwing more people into those detention centers. So I think like right off the bat, if we just remove privatization, I think a lot of people would be more, not okay, but what I'm saying is like they're going to be happier about it. But then we're going to want more, we're going to have more questions, more transparency. But I think like that's just one of the steps. You know, when I'm hearing about how much people, like I heard, it seems like on average people are like paying 10 grand just to be bailed out so they can at least do something with their lives instead of being stuck in a detention center. But I've heard even up to 30,000. You know, like at this point, it's like it sounds like they're trying to pay for college. So it sounds ridiculous. And I would say maybe that could be a good first step right now.
Great, thank you for that. Our next question is, why do we focus on migration rather than on making every country livable for all their citizens?
I mean, it's a good question, right? I mean, like, I think we all want an ideal world where, you know, each country can, you know, support themselves, be sustainable, everybody's happy. But I think when you just look at any history book, you realize that the world isn't as perfect, that there has been superpowers that played a big critical role in shaping our current world. I feel like for me, I think that question, I see the validity of it in sort of like in the curiosity, but it to me, it's just, there's a lot of history, especially in the US and South America, being involved, kind of shaking things up there, still doing that. And you know, there is a lot of like just instability. Other factors are obviously the economics in the world, right? Like, how can we expect some place like China to actually pay decent wages for employees and making sure they're doing well when we're over here just trying to get everything as cheap as we can? So I think like in order to have a world where people can, you know, live in their countries and keep their cultures, then we're going to ask ourselves as Americans to really change who we are. I think another question, if we're going to ask like, why can people just stay in their countries and like support themselves, then I would ask like, why can the US fix things that, you know, mistakes that we have done? I mean, we're talking about things like reparations, right? Like that never occur in other countries, you know, that they also have slaves. Like that did happen. They had the conversation in a serious manner. And if we're not ready to even talk about reparations, then I don't think we can be asking countries to kind of get their own stuff, you know, figured out.
I'd like to give a 2-point answer, if I may. The first point is the kind of defensive point, which is we do. And in the Quaker UN office, our work focuses on human rights generally, which is about making people safe where they are, making them safe from people in positions of authority over them. We work on peace building and prevention of violent conflict. We work on just global economic systems, and we work on climate change. So all of the other program areas that we have are about how do people live a life in dignity and justice wherever they are. But the bigger point I want to make, and that's come through in a couple of the questions I've seen in the chat box as well, is about whether we think migration is something that is there to be controlled, and whether we think migration is something that is a challenge, and whether we think migration is caused by these factors. Now, some migration is caused by some of these factors, but migration is a human phenomenon. It's part of human history. It's core to who we are and how we have developed as humanity over time, and with a really long view. And that's what I really like about the poem Marisa read at the beginning. It's reminding us that people have always moved. There is this desire in us. There is a desire to move for safety, for comfort, for interest, for something new. And it's relatively recent that the lines that are drawn between countries have made that more or less possible for different people, depending on who they are, where they're from, and who got to draw the lines. And so I think for me, one of the things about the Quaker migration statement was stepping back and saying, not just we don't want migration controlled in this way, but what is it that is problematic about migration? What is it that makes it a problem for people? And how do we think about this as a human phenomenon? And it is a problem for people when it's not a choice. And so, yes, we do need to address those things that mean that people get to live in safety and dignity where they want to live. But we maybe need to ask ourselves as well, why is it okay for me to move to Switzerland because there's an interesting looking job there, but it's not okay for somebody else to cross a border because there's an interesting looking job or a nice looking mountain they'd like to live by, or because the fields are more fertile, and how recent in our history it is that we've prevented those kinds of things. So that's the two-part. One, yes, absolutely. And two, let's think about what migration is for human beings, not just what it is as a policy problem.
Yes, thank you, Laurel and Oscar, for that. And I want to uplift both your points, and especially what was written in the chat as well, and what Oscar mentioned about the influence of US and Central America and South America, and even currently US foreign policy to Central America specifically is, you know, providing money to what we will call very corrupt and human rights violations governments. So that might be a place to start when it comes to thinking about this question. And since we're close with time, I'm just gonna wrap us up really quick and ask you both, what are the prospects for change in the coming year? Any closing thoughts or remarks moving forward for immigration justice?
So I am an optimist, or I work with hope and for long-term change. And I think the hope that I see at the moment is in, you talked about Band-Aids and about how the things we work for sometimes aren't actually going to solve the problems that we see. And I would absolutely agree with that. That's the same in terms of international policy as well. The Global Compact on Migration that we worked on is very flawed, but it's a really significant step forward for states to come together and say, migration policies should be based on the welfare of people, not based on the economic interests of countries. And I see at the moment, after a really rocky political birth of that compact, with the US not engaging, with right-wing groups making significant trouble with it, essentially a firestorm around it in Europe, that it's actually bedding in, and we're getting not just countries who voted for it, but countries who even didn't vote for it using it as part of how they are now legislating and planning on migration. And so I think it's the hope in the long-term change of things that helps me. And then the other thing that helps me is connecting with other people, as we've talked about. And each time somebody sends us a message about the Quaker Migration Statement, whether it's in agreement or not, it's like a little bubble of upholding for our work, because even if it's a challenge to something that we've said, we learn, or we're informed, or we're inspired by what comes back to us from having put out there something that we believe. So thank you all very much for your interest in this issue and the work that you all do.
Yeah, and something I'll quickly say is that, you know, I feel like I'm very critical, obviously, of the country that I love, just because like I feel like there's so much potential that we have here. I know, for example, people like my parents who are undocumented immigrants, they love this place, right? Like it's almost like it fathoms me. Like I'm like, how can you love some place that really mistreats you like this? And it's just because, like, you know, like they also see how much potential this country has, like for me, things like that. So it's almost like they're okay with like paying this like immigrant tax, and it's hard for me to like get over that. But I think what that shows me is just that while there may be like parents or older immigrants that aren't necessarily as critical, I think like there is this new generation of younger immigrants, more of like youth immigrant, that are becoming professionals now. They're growing their families, people basically with DACA, that are going to be like the next generation of like continuing this conversation. So I do see the potential of long-term changes coming ahead, as our society being more kind of like diverse and more diverse, even the things that we want to advocate for in policy. So I feel like it's going to be exciting times ahead. I like, you know, like I mentioned, conversing with people. I like that everybody here, I feel like, has that kind of spirit where they want to learn more. And that's great, because, you know, sometimes I wish even younger people did that more often. So I really appreciate everybody being here, and thank you for listening.
Thank you both, Laurel and Oscar, for having this conversation with me today. And I look forward to working with you both in advancing migration policy at different levels. So thank you both again. And with that, I'll pass that to Bobby to close this up.
Yes, thank you for such an amazing panel discussion. This was so rich, and I'm so grateful for the many perspectives that you were able to bring and share with us today. Before we conclude our discussion of Quakers and migration, I want to make sure you know about a few things. So I dropped a link in the chat on QUNO's work and what Laurel's doing in the refugee and migrants area if you want to learn more about their work. But if you're in the US, I want to share some ways that you can take action on immigration with FCNL right now from the comfort of your own home. I'm going to take you on a quick tour of fcnl.org and show you a bunch of different resources and web pages to support you in your advocacy work. And don't worry, we'll include all of these links in the follow-up email along with a link to the recording of the event. So you don't have to worry about scrambling to write everything down and remember where everything is. With that, I will start sharing my screen. All right, so first thing I want to show you, this is just the home page of fcnl.org, and you can find kind of everything that you might want to see here, our latest updates and articles, a number of our advocacy programs and events, upcoming major events, and information on all of the different issues we work on. But specifically, I want to show you a few programs that might support you in doing immigration advocacy work. So first is our letter writing project. This is a program where you can sign up to receive monthly timely action alerts and sample letters and phone scripts for Congress. We send it out on the second Saturday of every month, and you can download past letters right here. So for February, our ask and our action alert was on the Dream and Promise Act, and we called it Friends Uniting for Migration Justice to lift up the power of that Quaker Statement on migration and to use it in our advocacy work with the US Congress. You can also actually take action right now through our FCNL Action Center by following the link in the chat. Here you'll see an action alert with a call to action that describes the issue of the Dream and Promise Act and the importance of passing it. And then you'll see a sample letter template that you can customize with your own story and your own faith or your own values about why you want to see a more just immigration system. And then you can click submit at the bottom here, and that will send off letters directly to your members of Congress. Also, Oscar is a part of the Advocacy Corps program, and I wanted to share a link to where you can meet the other organizers in his class right there. Just put it in the chat. And if you're interested in lobbying on immigration reform and for those important policies, it's actually possible to connect with any of these organizers if they're in your state and to go on a virtual lobby visit with them. So if you want to do that, you can contact me about that at rtrice@fcnl.org, and I can connect you with one of the Advocacy Corps organizers. We also, our applications for the Advocacy Corps are open. So if you know any young adults who might be interested in this program, we would love for you to tell them about it. And you can just share the link with them. It's the deadline is April 12th to apply. Finally, if you're interested in taking action with your Quaker community, you can join with the Quaker Statement on Migration, pass your own minute as an advocacy tool, and send it to your members of Congress as part of a larger corporate Quaker witness, using this Quaker Statement, again, to put pressure on the US government to enact much needed immigration reform. And if you're interested in getting any support for that process and taking action with your Quaker community, you can also get in touch with me for support in relaying your minute to members of Congress or in preparing for a lobby visit on this topic. And then finally, I just want to let you all know about our next Quaker Changemaker event in March. It'll be called Bringing Ourselves into Lobbying. And it'll be an intergenerational conversation about what bringing ourselves into lobbying looks like. Speakers will offer their own experiences, encourage us all to consider how identity affects our lobbying, and discuss the ways that power and privilege show up and can be challenged through congressional advocacy. And I'll put a link to the registration page for that event in the chat as well. And this again will all be in the follow-up email that should be coming out later today or tomorrow. And with that, ever faithfully onward we go, friends. Go forth, be well, and know you are beloved. Take care, everyone.